I've always been fascinated by the work of the late Kenji Eno and his company, Warp. To me, Mr. Eno and Warp were kind of like the Suda51 and Grasshopper Studios of today, only, dare I say it, a bit more bold and experimental with their games. They made things like Real Sound, Winds of Regret, which was essentially a video game for the blind people, and Enemy Zero, a game which was heavily inspired by sci-fi horror films of the late 70s that involved the main character killing aliens that you could only hear. It's sad to say that, back in the mid to late 90s, experimental games were aided and published by big-name companies like Sega and Capcom, but if Warp existed now, they would have a hard time pitching some of their games to even the most experimental and avant-garde of game publishers. It is most likely due to their unique nature and rareness that games by Warp are so very expensive on websites like eBay and Amazon. This is the main reason why I haven't actually played any of Eno's games until Night Dive Studios, the people behind the new System Shock remake, released 1995's DE on Steam and GOG for $5.99. To say that I was excited would be an understatement. D takes place in the distant future of 1997 Los Angeles, where a violent mass murder has taken place in a hospital by the once benevolent Dr. Richard Harris. His daughter, Laura Harris, is contacted by the police and sent into the hospital to hopefully negotiate with Richter and find out why he went on a killing spree in the first place. But not long after entering the hospital, Laura is teleported to a mansion outside the confines of reality itself. With the exception of the all-too-frequent visits by the disembodied head of your father, the story ceases to be important the moment you enter the spooky mansion. In all honesty, the plot seems like an excuse for the setting to really even be there. It isn't something that bothers me that much, as I believe the main focus of Warp's D was to create an unsettling atmosphere and create an environment that is both familiar and distant. Just wandering through the empty mansion as low tones ring off in the background make the game seem like a fever dream that can slip into a nightmare at any moment. This is helped by the great musical composition by Kenji Eno himself. I'm not lying when I say this game put me on edge throughout most of its runtime. And this is coming from a guy who breezed through all of Silent Hill and Amnesia without breaking a sweat. I will admit, though, that a better story would have helped further this atmosphere and enrich the game's tone overall. The gameplay for D is similar to Myst, as the game is comprised of only full motion videos. You can only move down certain preset pathways and interact with certain puzzle objects. It's like a point-and-click adventure game, without the pointing and the clicking. Unlike Myst, you turn right and left with the right and left arrow keys, move forward and backwards with the up and down arrow keys, press I for inventory and space for select. It's as simple can be. However, there are some things that the game doesn't really tell you, and you have to figure it out by yourself. Like the fact that you can't save in D, so plan your time accordingly before you start this game. This isn't that bad though, considering that you have to beat the game in 2 hours or else it's game over. Which, in my opinion, is a smart way of building the player's tension subconsciously. The last thing is that, should you get stumped, you can look at your pocket mirror to help guide you, but the more you use it, the more cracked it gets before it eventually breaks. When you aren't walking and staring at things, you'll be doing puzzles. These puzzles can range from incredibly easy, tricky yet rewarding, to downright time-consuming bullshit. Most of the puzzles fall under the Resident Evil brand style of puzzles, the find X item and put it into Y to open Z kind of thing. Most of the time this is a breeze, but sometimes they might throw a curveball and make the process of going from X to Z a bit harder. Then there comes the bullshit I was speaking about earlier. These puzzles aren't hard. In fact, you might even know the solution before you even start the puzzle. Yet, stuff like this number box require great timing and a lot of patience. It drains whatever time you have, and it really is just aggravating to say the least. The same can be said for the slow and boring crank room, which makes up the last third of the game. Basically, you have to move a crank which will revolve a room itself. Most of the time you'll hit a dead end, but sometimes you'll hit a door. Sometimes. Overshoot the door and you have to crank a full 360 in order to get back there. In short, it's tedious, it's boring, and it's awful. Now, as I stated, this isn't the first time that the game uses FMVs instead of in-game graphics. Myst and the Mansion of Hidden Souls did it 2 years prior. However, unlike both of these games, D isn't awful. Okay, that is a bit unfair, especially considering that the Mansion of Hidden Souls was released on the Sega CD. But the level of detail found in D is pretty amazing. Sure, the animations might look stilted now, and it is, but back in 1995, this was the bee's knees. There are some technical issues though. For one, recording the game in full screen was a nightmare and dropped the frames dramatically to the point where the game became a chugging mess. Recording in windowed mode proved to be a bit easier, but there are some other problems that arose because of this, such as pretty awful case of screen tearing at the start of the game. Another thing to note is that D also comes with 2 packed-in versions of DOSBox. There's the regular version, which can be a bit unstable at times, and then there's the custom version of DOSBox. This custom version runs better, but it also has these strange dark CRTV-esque scan lines that look like this. So, pick your poison. Warp's D is a very unique and very flawed game, to say the least. It's aged, and some of the gameplay is boring and frankly archaic by today's standards. It isn't helped by some of the technical issues either. Yet, despite all of this, D is an atmospheric masterpiece that makes up for its shortcomings with a lot of interesting set pieces, game mechanics, and a level of detail that is not usually seen in many FMV-based games. Honestly, I'm really glad to see that Night Dive Studios actually took an interest in some of Warp's games and posted D where people interested in Kenji Eno's work can easily grab hold of it. And while Sega still holds the publishing rights for Enemy Zero and D, I'm keeping my fingers crossed in hopes that someday we'll get to see them released on Steam or GOG.